I've lived in 6 different countries my whole life, and not a lot of people can say that.
Allow me to properly introduce myself. My name is Petronella Risita Chang. I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, September 13th, 1996, and about 2 months after I was born, I picked up and moved to a completely different country. And moving around the whole world has basically been my whole life ever since.
Um, I'd say growing up, I never really identified myself as a third culture kid. I think that label really was given to me by, the way other individuals saw me because my background was a lot different than, a lot of people.
Hey,
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. This right here is my friend Rania. We've been friends for 6 years and we went to the same high school and middle school together. And she is also studying film production and she's also lived all over the world. So I would absolutely love to get her perspective and ideas on being a third culture kid. Just gonna get right into it. I just kind of
Yeah.
feel like I just want to get like your perspective on, being a third culture kid because I know like you've moved basically your whole life and also you don't only represent the the nationalities from like the countries that you've lived in, but you are mixed race, well, mixed um
Yeah.
and
I yeah.
and I don't know,
Go
I
ahead.
like how do you kind of like feel about that and like kind of like coming into university and being with so many people who are from like all over the world but also like different places in the states and stuff like that, like how do you feel about that?
Well, I always found it kind of difficult because I had this funny relationship with my identity and the cultures I was from because I never really felt like I deserved to call myself Chinese or to call
Yeah.
myself Tunisian, even though I'm half Chinese and half Tunisian because I felt that if I didn't look like it enough to other people, they wouldn't believe me or it didn't count or something like that. So I
Yeah.
struggled with that a little bit. And I didn't like just calling myself American because I never grew up in America and I didn't know how things worked over there.
Yeah.
And wherever people say they're from, everyone has a certain expectation of them to have a certain relationship to that place. And for third culture kids, you really don't have a
Yeah.
specific relationship to each of these places, at least not the same relationship other people might.
Yeah.
So that was definitely hard. And I mean, growing up around, now going to university with so many people that are from the US, it makes me jealous because things that I don't know about, and the knowledge that I don't yet have is kind of what's at the forefront of the conversation. It's at the surface level. So I
Yeah.
feel like I'm, not adequate, even though I'm from the States. So really
Yeah.
the question I'm afraid they're thinking is, what's wrong with you?
Yeah. I can kind of relate because I feel like sometimes I kind of avoid telling people that I'm Kenyan, not because I'm like ashamed of it in any way cuz I'm really proud of it, but I think people kind of underestimate my level of like my
Yeah.
Kenyanness, if that's a thing, like because of first of all the way that I talk and just they can obviously tell when they meet me that like I haven't lived in Kenya for very long. Like it's not just by my accent or whatever, but just like the way I'll talk about different things and they're like, "Hey, you haven't really lived in Kenya, have you?" And I'm like, "No, I haven't," or whatever. And sometimes people will like second guess and be like, "Are you really from Kenya?" And
That's a painful question. That
it's
kind of hurts,
it kind of
Because,
hurts.
you have a complicated relationship with each of the places that you've been to and each
Yeah.
of the places that you live. And one, people tend to not really understand that relationship, and two, their relationship with their hometown is often a little more simplistic, and they don't understand
exactly
how it might be different. Yeah,
exactly.
Which is not to say that they're not competent enough. It's just in terms of what you've lived through.
Yeah.
And until they're able to really get that, it's hard for them to understand.
Do you ever feel like sometimes when you kind of explain to new people that you're meeting about like your life and being a third culture kid, that like it might come off a little snobby and people might think that you're really kind of like full of yourself, when really it's not like that?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to not want to bring up the question of where I'm from. I tend to not like to be asked that question very much because I don't know how to answer, and I have to make a big deal out of it, and I don't want it to be a big deal. I don't want to spend time in the conversation saying that I moved around every fucking year. I don't want to have to explain everything to people because it's a long story. And 90% of the story is, and then we moved to, and I don't really want to be, I mean, I'd love to be identified as somebody who has a life like that, but I don't want people to think that that's all I can talk about, or that I like talking about it because it makes me look cool or anything like that. It's often the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of relate because a lot of the like situations I get into, even just like in conversation, I'll be like, oh, when I lived in this place, and it's not even to seem like I'm so cool, like I've lived all over the world. It's more like to kind of place myself in a situation, in the same situation with the person I'm conversating with, you know?
And not only that, it's us giving context. So often people say, oh, when I was 9, or oh, when I was in middle school. For us, it's easier for us to break our lives up into the pieces of where we were living. So often we start a story with, oh, when I was in Zim. And it's because that's how we remember that period of time rather than middle school, high school, whatever. And to some people that can make it seem like we're trying to interject into the conversation and be like, oh, when I traveled here and when I did this, and it's really not at all. It's a hard thing to talk about without sounding like that.
So Eric Weimeister is a student at Andrews University and recently did a TED Talk on being a third culture kid. His TED Talk in particular is very interesting because he breaks it down for his audience who aren't third culture kids and really just gives them an idea of what our characteristics are like and really just our mindset. And so it's a very, very well done TED Talk.
I think Eric Weimeister, I think that's his name. I think his TED Talk was probably one of the most interesting TED Talks I have ever watched, and that's probably because he talks about building an identity, when you're a third culture kid, because your nationality isn't your identity. I know that's what it's like for a lot of individuals, but for us, I think it's a lot of different other things that counterpart as our identity instead of our nationality, because we don't just have one nationality. I think the fact that he talks about he puts it in a scenario where it's able to appeal to university students because he is a university student is very educating, not just for someone who isn't a third culture kid, but also for, someone like me. So in Eric's TED Talk, he kind of talks about development, and he talks about benefits and challenges of being a third culture kid. And the very first benefit he kind of talks about is autonomy, and I think that really does resonate with a lot of third culture kids, and that's just because we learn to self-govern ourselves and we learn to be incredibly independent, as much as our parents are there with us, they also give us room for us to kind of adjust and also just mature. And so a particular event I think I can kind of reflect on that correlates to this is when I lived in Sweden. I was about 9 years old, and at this point we had been living in Sweden for a year. And my mom works with the embassy, and she would have the driver pick me up every day from school, and then he would just pick up some of the other embassy kids as well, and we would all go to school together. However, I'm not really sure if any of you guys are familiar with Sweden, or rather really in Europe. A lot of kids who are a lot younger than I was at 9 years old went to school by themselves, and this was just something that was so weird to me because yes, even though I had lived abroad, I was always taken to school by an adult. You know, whether it was my mom, whether it was my aunt, whether it was a driver, I was always taken to school by an adult. So I just was not used to, you know, going to school on my own. It was so strange. And I remember my mom said that, you know, you're gonna have to grow up, you're gonna have to be a big girl, and you're gonna have to go to school by yourself. And that really scared me because I wasn't sure what was gonna happen. And so at 9 years old, right up until 13, which was when I left Stockholm, I traveled to school on the train by myself, didn't have an adult, never went to school with my mom by my side or my parents or, you know, any adult. And yeah, it was definitely something that I had to kind of self-govern and also just find a spot of maturity in me to actually just go ahead and do it by myself. But I'm sure that, you know, if you put, you know, a child who has never moved abroad, you know, in that particular situation, they're not as comfortable adjusting. I knew that I had to adjust because I was living in a new place, and each kind of place that I've lived in, I've had to adjust something, you know. I've had to have given up a fear that I had in order to mature and to grow. And so this was just one step that I needed to take. So yeah, autonomy definitely resonates with me. One of the challenges that Eric talks about is education, and this is something that I wouldn't particularly talk about, but I think my mom would mention more than anything. And I think that's because most of the schools that I've been to are American international schools. I think only one school I've been to was British system, but the two aren't too far apart. I know for some of my friends in Kenya, there's like the Kenyan system, which is 844, and that's very different to a British system based school or even an American based school. But education was definitely difficult, and it's not because I'm in the same system from each school that I kind of moved to, but rather because each school's learning mechanism is completely different, and so having to adjust to that is definitely difficult. It's something that you have to adapt to, but sometimes it can hold you back, because I know when I moved to Kenya right after I lived in Sweden, I moved to Kenya for 10 months, and when I moved, everything I had learned in Sweden was so different than this British system school in Kenya that they didn't, like, English was fine, math was just horrible, not only because I was really bad at math, but because everything I had learned in math was just so completely different that they didn't know what to do. And so that was definitely something that that held me back. And I think now coming into university, I've never been to Australia. I've never even traveled to Australia. And now I live here, and it's actually quite interesting because learning a lot of the stuff was not difficult, but learning how they learn the stuff was a little difficult.
I think I'm always going to be moving around. I think I've gotten comfortable with that. A lot of people find security in, kind of just staying in one place. And for me, it's completely different. My security is constantly moving around the world and exploring and meeting different types of people with different cultures, different religions. And I think I've really learned to appreciate that. And so traveling really has just become part of my life. It's not just something I enjoy to do, but it's something that is going to stay on with me for the rest of my life. And so, yeah.
I'm a third culture kid, and I've lived in over 6 different countries.